Welcome to the deep dive. We hear so much about crime, right? True crime, news reports, it's everywhere.
It really is. Constantly.
But isn't it strange how often the actual victim kind of gets lost in the story? They seem almost out of focus.
That's a really important point. The focus tends to be elsewhere.
Exactly. So today we're shifting that focus. We're doing a deep dive into victimology.
Which is a specific part of criminology, right? Studying the victims themselves.
Precisely. Our mission here is to explore who's most likely to become a victim and, crucially, why. We'll be looking at some, quite different sociological ways of thinking about this.
And is quite a shift from how things used to be. I mean, historically, victims were, frankly, almost ignored in crime studies.
Really? Just focused on the offender?
Mostly, yes. The offender, the act itself.
Mm-hmm.
But in recent decades, sociologists realized, this is a huge gap. That led to completely new ways of understanding the victim's experience.
Okay, so the victim moves from the sidelines to, front and center. What helped make that happen? Was it data?
A big part of it was the development of victim surveys. Think about the crime survey for England and Wales, the CSEW.
Ah, right. Those are the ones that ask people directly about crime.
Exactly. They go straight to households asking about experiences, whether or not they reported anything to the police.
So they get at all the unreported crime, the stuff police stats miss.
Precisely. It gives us this much richer, probably more accurate picture of who's actually being victimized. Reveals that huge, dark figure of crime we didn't see before.
Okay, so these surveys show us who is being victimized, maybe more than we thought. How do sociologists then try to explain why? Sounds like there isn't just one simple answer.
Oh, definitely not. You've basically got two main, quite contrasting camps or approaches within victimology.
Two different ways of looking at it.
Yeah. On one side, there's what we call positivist victimology.
Positivist. Okay, what's their angle?
Their main goal is to identify patterns, to find factors that seem to correlate with being victimized. They're looking for statistical links, essentially.
Patterns. So like demographics, age, gender, that kind of thing.
Often, yeah, it starts there. They look at age, gender, social class where people live.
And do patterns emerge?
Very clearly.
Uh-huh.
For instance, studies consistently show that, say, young men, people living in poorer urban areas, and individuals from ethnic minorities often have a much higher risk for certain types of crime.
So it's not just random chance.
According to this view, no. Positivist victimology suggests these factors aren't just background noise. They actively increase vulnerability. It makes us confront some uncomfortable truths about who is most at risk in society.
That makes sense. But I remember hearing about something a bit controversial connected to this early on, something called victim precipitation.
Ah, yes. That was an early concept within this positivist tradition. And you're right, it was and remains quite controversial.
Because it sounds a bit like it's blaming the victim, suggesting their actions contributed.
It did carry that implication, unfortunately. The idea hinted that maybe something the victim did or didn't do played a part in the crime happening.
Which feels pretty uncomfortable.
Extremely. And while that specific idea of precipitation is largely discredited now, or at least heavily critiqued for that blaming aspect, the underlying positivist approach evolved.
How so?
Well, it led to more nuanced theories, like routine activity theory, for example.
Routine activity theory.
Yeah, it looks at how crime happens when you get three things converging. Someone motivated to offend, a suitable target, meaning a person or place, and the lack of a capable guardian, like police or even just, other people around.
Okay, so that's less about the victim's actions and more about the situation.
Exactly. It explains risk based on lifestyle and circumstances without blaming the victim. But that general positivist focus, the idea of identifying risk factors, understanding who is statistically more likely to be victimized and why, that's still pretty influential. You see it in crime prevention policies and so on.
Okay, so that's the positivist view, looking for patterns, risk factors, maybe situational elements. What's the other side of the coin then, the contrasting approach?
That would be critical victimology. And it takes a very different, much more, radical stance.
Radical how?
Critical victimologists argue that the positivist focus on patterns and individual risk misses the bigger picture. They point to the role of power, social structures, and even the state itself.
The state? How does the state come into it?
They argue the state, through the criminal justice system and its laws, has immense power to define who counts as a victim in the first place.
Ah, so it's about who gets the label victim.
Precisely. They'd say the system often decides who gets recognized and legitimized as a victim, and crucially, who doesn't.
Can you give an example of that?
Sure. Think about the difference in how society, and maybe the state, views the victim of, say, a street mugging versus the victims of massive corporate pollution.
Yeah. The mugging victim is clearly seen as a victim. The pollution victims, maybe less so. Or it's more complex.
Exactly. Critical victimologists would argue the state might minimize or even deny the victim status of those harmed by corporate or state actions, especially if those harmed are already marginalized. The label victim becomes a sort of political tool.
Wow. And you mentioned the state itself could be a perpetrator.
Yes, that's a key part of their critique. They argue the state can directly cause victimization through things like warfare, illegal police violence, torture, or even by failing to act on things like environmental destruction or climate change, which harms huge numbers of people whose suffering often gets ignored or downplayed.
That's a completely different way of looking at it. So if they're not focused on individual risk factors or behaviors, what are critical victimologists focusing on?
They shift the lens right onto social inequality, onto power dynamics, who has power in society and who doesn't, and onto the actions or inactions of the state itself.
So it's about the system.
Fundamentally, yes. It's arguing that victimization often isn't just about bad luck or individual choices, but it's baked into the structure of society, linked to poverty, discrimination, and how state power operates. It's a much more systemic view.
Okay, let's just quickly recap these two big ideas then. We've really journeyed from a time when victims were almost invisible in criminology
Right, a huge shift.
to now having these two quite distinct ways of studying them. First, there's positivist victimology.
Yep. Focused on identifying those patterns, the risk factors, showing us, for example, why certain groups, young men, the urban poor, ethnic minorities, face higher risks.
And even though that early victim precipitation idea is largely, set aside,
Thankfully, yes.
the core idea of identifying risk factors, understanding vulnerability based on demographics or situation, that still shapes a lot of policy thinking.
It definitely does. It influences crime prevention strategies, policing tactics, things like that.
Then completely differently, you have critical victimology.
Right. And this is the radical critique. It puts power, social structure, and the state right at the center.
Arguing that the state plays a huge role in just defining who gets to be seen as a victim.
Exactly. Pointing out how victims of, say, corporate crime or state negligence might be ignored compared to victims of street crime.
And even suggesting the state itself can be the source of harm through things like war or environmental damage.
Yes. It really forces a shift away from just looking at individual behavior or situations towards examining deep-seated social inequalities, power imbalances, and the state's role and responsibilities.
It's definitely a much broader, more structural way of seeing things.
Wow.
It really does give you a much more nuanced understanding, moving way past just ignoring victims to actually analyzing their experiences through these contrasting lenses.
It certainly does. It complexifies the whole picture of crime and harm.
So, the final thought for you listening. What does understanding these different perspectives, the positivist and the critical, what does that mean for how you might look at news stories about crime? Or even how you think society should respond to all the different kinds of harm that happen? Makes you think, doesn't it?